Right now, I'm going to give you corrections for both the last worksheet that you had to turn in that was assigned on Thursday and on the quiz that you had to take on Friday. By the way, it most probably would have been smart to go over the corrections for the worksheet before I gave you the quiz because some of the same problems are on both. But I did tell you before you took the quiz to go back and look at the video that explained about parallelograms. Anyway, it's very important that you understand what's on these corrections because it appears that we're not going back to school again this year. And if we're not going back to school again this year, you won't be able to turn in your quiz corrections to change it to 100. But I've thought about that a lot, and what I've decided to do is give you a quiz 5 that has the stuff from the other 4 quizzes on it. If you learn from your mistakes, you'll get 100 on quiz 5. And if you get 100 on quiz 5, I give you 100 average for all 5 quizzes. By the way, if you don't get 100 on quiz 5, I average quiz 5 with the other 4 quizzes to give you an average. So it's very important before you take quiz 5 early this week coming up, it's very important that you make sure you understand what you're doing. And that's why I'm going over these corrections with you. On the worksheet, on the homework, these were your right answers. Number 1 was a rhombus. Number 2 was a rectangle. Number 3 was a rhombus, a rectangle, and a square, all 3 things. Number 4, the sides were line segment AB, line segment BC, line segment CD, and line segment AD. Number 5, the missing side was 5 centimeters. Number 6, the missing side was 3 centimeters. And number 7, the angles measurements were 134 degrees, 134 degrees, and 46 degrees. So now I'll explain where those answers come from. And again, this is the type of stuff that could be on the quiz 5, so you need to know it, so pay attention. First thing is, number 1 says, identify each parallelogram as many ways as possible. Well, there are 3 types of parallelograms: rhombuses, rectangles, and squares. There was only 1 line under this one, which means it was only one of the 3 things. And which of the 3 things was this? Well, all the sides are congruent, and you know they're congruent because they have little line segments through each of the sides. That represents congruence. All the sides have little line segments through them, so all sides are congruent. That makes it a rhombus. That's an S. Now, the next one, number 2, looked like this. And definitely all the sides are not congruent, so it's definitely not a rhombus. But when you look at it, all the angles are congruent because all the angles are 90 degrees. How I know they're 90 degrees? They're L-shaped, and they have a little box on them. And again, if all the angles are 90 degrees, we call that a rectangle. And again, that's all it is a rectangle. It's not a rhombus, and it's not a square. It only had 1 line. Now the third one down there, trying to squeeze it in here before I erase, it's got all sides congruent because it's got those little line segments through all 4 sides. It's got all angles at 90 degrees congruent because they got little L shapes on all the angles. So since all the sides are congruent, that makes it a rhombus. Since all the angles are congruent, that makes it a rectangle. So this is a rhombus, a rectangle, and again, if it's both a rhombus and a rectangle, that's what makes it a square. And I'm trying to fit this in on the board before we get past where you can see. I hope I got it all in. I think I did. But again, a rhombus has all sides congruent, but not all angles congruent. A rectangle has all angles congruent, but not all sides congruent. And a square has all sides and all angles congruent, which means a square is a rhombus and a rectangle both. By the way, that's why all squares are rhombuses and all squares are rectangles. But all rhombuses are not squares and all rectangles are not squares. So, excuse me, that's where you get the answer to 1, 2, and 3. Now, for the answers to the rest of them, they have a consider. And the consider looks like this. it is a parallelogram, and the reason I know it's a parallelogram is because I have two pairs of parallel lines. Line AB and line DC are parallel. Line AD and line BC are parallel. All right, and it said, name the sides of the parallelogram. Now what you need to know, this goes way back to the very beginning of geometry that we learned before we even were let out of school. Okay, way back in the very beginning, we learned when you have an endpoint, like it starts at A and ends at B, when you have a set of points that connects two endpoints, that's called a line segment. So this side right here is called line segment AB. By the way, you should have wrote AB with a line segment symbol on top. That was a little hard to put on the answer sheet. A couple of people did, good job. A number of people couldn't figure out how to do it, and if you can't, then you just write AB and I gave you credit. By the way, I learned from my mistakes, I won't ask you to name the sides of a parallelogram again, or of any polygon. Anyway, the next side starts at B and ends at C, and it connects the points, so that's line segment BC. The next one ends at C and D, and it connects all the points. That's line segment CD. And the next one starts at A and ends at D. That's line segment AD. By the way, it didn't matter whether you called it line segment AD or line segment DA. You could have called this line segment AB or line segment BA, line segment BC or line segment CB, or line segment CD or line segment DC. By the way, some of you were like totally blown away by the question, name the sides of the parallelogram. But you shouldn't have been if you stop and think for a minute. We learned that a parallelogram is a quadrilateral. And we learned that quadrilateral is a simple closed curve made up of line segments. So the sides of a parallelogram have to be line segments. And if you didn't remember those definitions, you could look and see it starts at A and ends at B, and it's all the points in between. That makes it line segment AB. Anyway, I won't be asking you that kind of question again because it's hard to name the line segment. It's hard to figure out how to put the little line segment symbol on the top of it. Again, a couple of you did, great job, but I'm not going to make you do that. Anyway, number 5 says, be nice if I took the top off. Number 5 says line segment AB is equal to 5 centimeters, and it wants to find line segment DC. Okay, by the way, we learned on the back of the last quiz 3 corrections, I gave you some notes, and one of them said opposite sides of a parallelogram are congruent. So if line segment AB was 5 centimeters, then line segment CD or DC is opposite it, and it's 5 centimeters, because opposite sides are congruent. So that's your answer right here. In the same way, it said line segment AD equaled 3 centimeters, and it wanted you to find line segment BC. And once again, since this is 3 centimeters, and since I told you opposite sides are congruent, if this is 3 centimeters, that's going to be 3 centimeters. So opposite sides of a parallelogram have the same measurement. So if I give you one side, you know the side opposite. Okay? And again, that was in the notes. Most of you are able to get that. Some of you were like totally blown away and lost by it. I hope you now understand what I meant when I said opposite sides are congruent. Now, lastly, I told you the measure of one angle. I told you the measurement of angle B equaled 46 degrees. And then I asked you to find the measure of angle A, the measure of angle C, and the measure of angle D. Now again, to understand this, you had to go back to those notes at the end of corrections for quiz 3 that said opposite angles of a parallelogram are congruent and consecutive angles of a parallelogram are supplementary. Now again, to understand if the measure of angle B equals 46, all right, I need to know what's opposite that? And again, the opposite angle is the one that doesn't have anything to do with this angle. And the angle that's opposite that would be angle D. And if this is 46, this is 46, because opposite angles are congruent. Now, what are consecutive angles? Consecutive means one after the other. And consecutive angles are supplementary. What does that mean? It means they add up to 180 degrees. So if A and B are next to each other, and they are one after the other consecutive, then they're supplementary. So if B is 46 and I want to find A, take 180 minus 46, and that'll tell you the one that you're looking for. Whoops. The one you're looking for is 134 degrees. And by the way, if you know that A is 134, you can find angle C one of two different ways. You could say that these are consecutive, and you could subtract 180 minus 46 again to find this one. Or you could say that these are opposite, and opposite angles of a parallelogram are congruent. But that makes angle C 134 degrees either one way or the other. So again, that's what you needed to know about parallelograms. You needed to know the three types of parallelograms: rhombi, rectangle, and squares. You needed to know that parallelograms were made up of line segments. And you needed to know that opposite sides of a parallelogram are congruent, the same measurement. Opposite angles of a parallelogram are congruent, the same measurement. And consecutive, one after the other, angles of a parallelogram are supplementary. And when you know one supplementary angle, subtract from 180 to get the other one. So that's the corrections for the worksheet. Now let's talk about the corrections for the quiz. Now, first of all, these are the answers that you needed to have for the quiz. Number one was the measure of angle B equaled 23 degrees. Number two, the measure of angle B equaled 138 degrees. Number three, the measure of angle C equaled 55 degrees. Number four is an acute scalene triangle. Number five is 3 centimeters. And number six, the measure of angle B is 68 degrees, and the measure of angle D is 112 degrees. And again, to find the answers for these, you need to know about 4 things. The first thing you needed to know about was the difference between complementary and supplementary angles. Complementary angles add up to 90 degrees, and supplementary angles add up to 180 degrees. And if you know one complementary angle, subtract from 90 to find the other one. If you know one supplementary angle, subtract from 180 to find the other one. The next thing you needed to know is about triangles. First of all, you needed to know, if you knew 2 angles of a triangle, how to find the third one. And the answer is the 3 angles add up to 180, so add up the 2 angles you know, subtract from 180 gives you the angle that's missing. And then the next thing you need to know is the types of triangles, which, by the way, some of you know really good, some of you don't know at all. There are 3 types of triangle by angles, either an acute triangle, obtuse triangle, or a right triangle. An acute triangle is one that has all angles less than 90 degrees. This triangle in this problem is an acute triangle. Then you have, by sides, either equilateral triangle, all 3 sides are congruent, isosceles triangle, 2 sides congruent, or scalene triangle, no sides congruent. This triangle had no little line segments saying that sides were congruent, so since it had no sides congruent, it was scaling. Then you needed to know the facts about parallelograms. Opposite sides of parallelograms are congruent, opposite angles of parallelograms are congruent, consecutive angles of parallelograms are supplementary. These are the type of things that could be on quiz 5, so you got to make sure you know. Now, first of all, different thing. The first question said angle A and angle B are complementary angles, and the measure of angle A equals 67 degrees. And it wanted you to find the measure of angle B. And again, they're complementary angles, so that means they add up to 90 degrees. So if you know one of them, you take 90 minus the one you know, and that tells you that the other one is 23 degrees. So if you know one of them's 67, the other has to be 23, because if I add these two together, they have to add up to be 90. And again, that makes the answer number one, 23 degrees, because complementary add up to 90. Number two says the measure of angle one of angle A and B are supplementary angles, and the measure of angle A is 42 degrees. Find the measure of angle B. Now again, supplementary angles add up to 180. So if the measure of angle A is 42 degrees, and you want to find the measure of angle B, you have to take 180 minus 42. And that would give you an answer here of 138 degrees. And again, some of you got them wrong because you mixed up complementary and supplementary. Some of you thought complementary was 180 and supplementary was 90, so you got answers that were totally wrong. So again, how can you remember complementary is 90, supplementary is 180? Think of this. In the alphabet, C comes before S. With numbers, 90 comes before 180. So the letter that comes first, C, goes with the number that comes first, 90. The letter that comes last, S, goes with the number that comes last, 180. So you do need to know that, okay, for those two problems. Now, on number 3, here was the consider. And again, it was a triangle that looked like this. And I told you that the measure of angle A equaled 53 degrees. The measure of angle B equaled 72 degrees. And I asked you to find the measure of angle C. All right? And again, by the way, I wrote it the way they do in geometry. I wrote given measure of angle A equals 53 degrees, measure of angle B equals 72 degrees. And then find measure of angle C. Now again, when you know two angles of a triangle and you're trying to find the third one, add the two you know. 72 plus 53, 3 plus 2 is 5, 7 plus 5 is 12. That's 125. Then take that answer away from 180. And again, if I want to take that away from 180, I got to borrow from the 8 and make it a 7. 10 minus 5 is 5. 7 minus 2 is 5. And that means angle C is 55 degrees. By the way, after you found the measurement of the angles, looking at the problem, I said to classify it by angles and by sides. By angles, all three angles, 53, 72, and 55, all three angles are acute. That means it's an acute triangle. Please remember, acute triangles, all three angles are acute. In a right triangle, one angle is 90 and two are acute. In an obtuse triangle, one angle is greater than 90 and two are acute. So when all three angles are acute, it's an acute triangle. And then by sides, if all three sides are congruent, it's equilateral. That would mean you'd have to have line segments through all three sides. You don't, so it's not an equilateral triangle. If it was isosceles, two sides would be congruent. That means two of these sides would have to have line segments between them. They don't, so it's not an isosceles triangle. You say, well, they have no sides congruent. That makes it a scalene triangle. By the way, it'd be nice if you knew how to spell the words, but I'll be happy if you just know how to know what they are, to identify them. And again, some of you are real good at this by now. I've given it to you like on 3 quizzes in a row, maybe on all 4 quizzes. I can guess you better understand there'll be something like this on the 5th quiz. But anyway, that's the answer to number, right here's the answer number 3, and here's the 2 answers to number 4. Now we go to the last one. We have another consider that looks a lot like the worksheet, okay? except I changed the numbers, the letters around a little bit. Still A, B, but then I put D here and C there. Doesn't change it much, but it does change a little bit if you just were trying to go with exactly the same thing. But anyway, number 5 says line segment AC equals 3 centimeters, and it asks you to find the opposite side. And the opposite side would be this one, so that means that line segment BD has to equal 3 centimeters, because opposite sides of a parallelogram are congruent. And then I told you in number 6 that the measure of angle A equals 112 degrees, and I asked you to find the measure of angle B and the measure of angle D. By the way, if A is 112, then the one that's easiest to find is the opposite angle, because it's the same measurement, and the opposite angle would be D, so D is 112. Now you say, well, how do you find this one? Well, these two angles are consecutive, one after the other, and consecutive angles are congruent. So if this is 112 and you want to find that one, take 180 minus 112, because they're supplementary, and you get this one is 68 degrees. So again, what you had on that worksheet, that was the same as what you had on that, excuse me, on that quiz, was problems 5 and 6. Again, opposite sides of a parallelogram are congruent, opposite angles of a parallelogram are congruent, consecutive angles of a parallelogram are supplementary. All right, but you had more in the quiz than just stuff about parallelograms. You had complementary and supplementary angles, and you had 2 angles of a triangle, find the missing third angle, and you had types of triangles. All of these things are things that will be on quiz 5. And again, you can't turn in corrections to change your grade to 100. But if you get 100 on quiz 5, you can change your average to 100 on all of them. So if you learn from your mistakes, and that's why I'm making all these correction videos, if you learn from your mistakes, you should still do really good on quiz 5, and you should get 100 average for this set of 5 quizzes. Things are different now. We're not in school. I can't do the things the way we normally do. But I think this is a fair way to really measure if you're learning from your mistakes. Good luck on quiz 5 when you take it, and I hope you understand what we did today.